Does Godzilla mean anything? Welcome back, guys. It's Zimzilla, and I want to talk a little bit about this idea and concept that Godzilla is the most versatile character in fiction because Godzilla can, quote-unquote, mean anything. So let's get into that. But if you're new here and you aren't, please do subscribe, and if you're feeling really generous, please check out the Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you'll get a shout out at the end of these videos, as well as at higher tiers, you'll be able to actually help decide the future of this channel and vote on certain video ideas or topics that you would like me to discuss. I also do commissions for art, and I also do consulting where it concerns your writing ideas, kaiju, characters, all that sort of stuff. But on to the topic of today's video. So, what does mean anything mean, actually? It sounds kind of weird, but when you really think about it, if Godzilla can mean anything, then what does Godzilla himself really mean? Because at that point, Godzilla isn't a vessel for anything objectively. Godzilla is just really a character, or at least a meta idea of a character, and the perception of Godzilla being giant dinosaur breathes fire to most people. And if you place Godzilla in that box, essentially, and say that Godzilla can mean anything, then ultimately you will lose a lot of what makes Godzilla unique. To start off, we always hear in the fandom the idea that Godzilla can be a hero, villain, or an anti-hero, but when we really think about it, a hero versus an anti-hero, oftentimes when these terms are used, refers to the idea that a hero has their morality placed squarely within the realms of the viewer. So whatever the hero does, the viewer in most cases will agree with the actions and the ideas that the hero upholds, whereas the anti-hero is oftentimes a character whose ends and ideas are sometimes similar to that of the viewer, but oftentimes the actions in which they will perform will in most cases be misaligned with morals and values of the viewer and what they hold to be true. As a result, can Godzilla really be considered a hero or anti-hero? Because in most cases, Godzilla's quote-unquote morality is not really aligned or even close to what we humans would consider to be morally right. I think that's often a problem that the films don't tackle, the monsterverse especially, which I'll go over in a longer form video. But when we think about it, Godzilla being a force of nature is a little bit closer to the idea that Godzilla can't really be a hero or a villain, because as a force of nature, Godzilla's morality is removed from the equation. But I also think that's not always true either. There are some that are forces of nature, but not all of them are. At least looking at the original Godzilla, due to being mutated and disturbed by the atomic bombs, Godzilla is very much a victim, but is an antagonistic force in both the film and in the novelization. Godzilla does go out of his way to kill people, and it's more pronounced in the novel because you actually see the writing and they specifically state that Godzilla is going after specific characters. Notable example of that being Emiko during the hill scene in both the film and the book. Godzilla, as he's rearing over and roaring before Emiko screams at him, in the book it stated that Godzilla was actually trying to claw at her and try to kill her specifically. So when it comes to at least the first Godzilla, that Godzilla is very much a villain and antagonistic force. And if we were to apply this metric to later Godzillas in the series, we can just go on to the second Godzilla. In Godzilla Rise Again, at least in the book version, it's less pronounced in the film. Godzilla, when he gets on Awado Island, is actually trying to claw at the two main characters. And as a result, Godzilla does go out of his way to kill people. And if we're talking about the grand scheme of morality, Godzilla has no reason to kill most of these people, given the fact that they aren't the people who mutated him or destroyed his home. So if we were to apply morality to Godzilla, Godzilla is very much a villain because he is unlawfully trying to kill people who have nothing to do with the grievances that he may have. Even in the later Showa series, Godzilla isn't really like a hero where his actions are going to be completely in line with that of our protagonist, or at least humanity as a whole. Like looking at Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, prior to Mothra talking to Godzilla and Rodan, Godzilla sinks an ocean liner by like using his atomic breath and killing those people. So even when Godzilla had started his heel shift, Godzilla had still murdered people unlawfully, or just there was no reason to kill those people at all before he fought against King Ghidorah. And going into Invasion of Astro Monster, outside of the mind control that him and Rodan are subject to, there really isn't an opportunity for Godzilla to to like show a more antagonistic side to humanity as he's on Planet X for most of that movie and then goes back down to Earth under mind control. And at that point, Ghidorah is in the way, so greater evil, yada yada, we know this. But the next film, Jin Fukuda's Ever Horror of the Deep, Godzilla isn't really a hero either, even though we want Godzilla to win against Ebra. But by the end of the film, even though Godzilla's fighting the Red Baboon, they're the enemies of our protagonist, the characters don't want to be anywhere near Godzilla. They try to avoid Godzilla at every opportunity, and when they're trying to rescue Dio, they don't want Godzilla to see them. So there isn't this like connection that Godzilla has with humanity to where people could say, oh, Godzilla's a hero in this case. And by the end of the film, Godzilla and Mothra get into a fight, and although it's a short one and Mothra just kind of carries the people off of the island and goes away, Godzilla is still has some kind of friction there with humanity. Whereas in Son of Godzilla, another film that a lot of people say that Godzilla's a little bit softer, the characters in that film still don't want anything to do with Godzilla, and when Godzilla actually gets onto Solgil Island, they're all trying to run and cover. Even though Godzilla doesn't notice these characters, the idea that, oh, Godzilla's here to protect us or here to save us, that is also not true within this film. And even though they see a softer side of Godzilla, and by the end, even though Reiko is sorry for Godzilla in Manila, they still don't really want anything to do with Godzilla or be near Godzilla as it is. And moving into Destroy All Monsters, Godzilla, even though this is probably his most earth-saving heroic he's ever been since he's with all these other monsters, Godzilla isn't still a hero to humanity by this point either. So we're pretty far into the Showa timeline as it is at this point, but Godzilla is being kept on Monsterland, and not by his own free will, as he tries to escape at one point, and they state this, and they actually have to try to keep Godzilla contained. So the idea that Godzilla is a hero isn't really true here, because at this point, they still need to keep Godzilla in line. And of course, the Keelocks mind control Godzilla, Godzilla goes on a rampage, and the film doesn't really allow us to see what Godzilla would want to do if he was not under mind control. But at that point, again, you have a larger threat, and that's a trend you see with a lot of these films where Godzilla can be considered a hero or an anti-hero only is present because there's just a larger threat, and as a result, Godzilla is the lesser of two evils, and instead of being the out-and-out villain, or I think more accurately the antagonist, Godzilla becomes a sort of protagonist by proxy. But if we were to also consider the fact that Destroy All Monsters takes place at the end of the timeline, Godzilla by the end of the Showa period is not the out-and-out hero that people believe him to be, and I think that this has to obviously do with the fact that Destroy All Monsters came before the Champion Era Festival Godzilla films, and as a result, Godzilla's characterization by the late 70s is very different from how they wanted him in the end of the 60s, and as a result, there's inconsistencies there. But if we even look at the Champion Era Godzilla films, we can start with Gigan, for example, where the only reason Godzilla is coming to intercept these monsters is because Godzilla sees a threat to the world rather than humanity itself. Godzilla is still not really on the page with humanity in that sense, and the only reason why they want to besiege Godzilla and want Godzilla helping at all is because he's going to stop other monsters. So again, this idea of Godzilla being a hero, it's closer, but you're still kind of stretching it. But it's in Godzilla vs. Megalon where Godzilla is the out-and-out hero of the franchise, because at this point, once the humans have gotten Jet Jaguar back under control, they asked Jet Jaguar to go bring Godzilla to help fight Megalon and, well, Gigan later on. But in this case, even if we are to assume that Godzilla is more on the side of humans, and at that point the Zone Fighter comes out later and you get the Monster Hero of Justice title for Godzilla, there is still this idea that Godzilla has personal stake in this due to the island he was on and Anguirus falling into that crater. There is still plausible deniability that there's personal stake for Godzilla to take part in this battle, and as a result, Godzilla is a hero mostly by proxy, even though Godzilla is far more friendlier, and you still see that in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla and Terra Mechagodzilla, where Godzilla is still more of the out-and-out hero. But in these fights, of course, dealing with budget and things of that nature, you don't see Godzilla battling as much in cities. But even if we were to consider this, most of the times when Godzilla is fighting in a city, that is still morally dubious, considering the fact that if we are in that situation, we're not the ones who want those buildings or our houses to get destroyed by Godzilla. Even if Godzilla is the moral good or the monster that people want on their side, I don't necessarily consider that to be out and out pure heroic. And looking at other movies, like Man of Steel being a good example of this, a lot of people take umbrage with how Superman conducts that battle, because Superman does a lot of actions in that film which maximize, or if not add more collateral damage, when if we are writing this and in the writing stage you have complete creative freedom to do whatever you want with these characters, Superman should be trying to preserve lives as much as possible, or doing things to minimize damage, with Zod being the one who should be adding to that, which can create a good dichotomy between the hero and villain. But we don't see that. And with Godzilla, I think that it's more passable and it's more acceptable for Godzilla to do this, because Godzilla's morality is sort of different from those of humanity's. But if that is the case, then we as a fandom, when we're discussing Godzilla's hero villain status, should not be considering him a hero or even an anti-hero by this point. And I think that's why the Heisei series does so well for Godzilla's character, because even throughout the entire series, like looking at Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah or Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla or Godzilla vs. Destroyer, Godzilla is still viewed as an antagonistic force. Even when you could say Godzilla is somewhat in the right, like in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 trying to get baby Godzilla, they still treat him as a danger and a threat. And as a result, Godzilla's character is far less intact than it is in something like the Showa era. And the Millennium films are really no different in that sense, where even if Godzilla on side is the character that we as the audience want to win in universe, in most of the Millennium films, Godzilla is not the character that they want to see win, because Godzilla's just going to keep on destroying things. And we see that in films like Godzilla vs. Megaguirus or Godzilla 2000, where he is fighting against an antagonistic monster and he's not fighting against humanity out and out. But if we were to really consider the fact that in most of the films, even in most of the Showa films, Godzilla isn't the out and out hero for humanity, it is very actually uncommon, if not the exception, that Godzilla is the hero, like the out and out hero to humanity. So as a result, when you really consider it, Godzilla doesn't really mean as much as people think he does. And going back to the Showa series, you can also talk about the fact that you have the film's themes, where with 54 you have the out and out understanding that nuclear weapons are bad, nuclear destruction is bad, look what it does to people, in this case specifically Japan. In 55 you still have those themes, but they're far more subdued as you're more focusing on the characters. And I think this is an interesting thing to consider, because at that point it is a film less about Godzilla and more about a world in which Godzilla exists. And I think that is where world building is important in other films. The Heisei series does this the best, and certain one-off films like GMK or the Kiryu duology also do this well, because they are films in which you are setting up a world where Godzilla is not new. Godzilla is a known entity, and as a result the world has changed to accommodate him. And that is important in considering what Godzilla means, because a lot of films in the Godzilla series are not films about Godzilla, but films with Godzilla. And I think one of the most interesting films to consider in this case is Godzilla vs. Hedorah. And the reason why I haven't brought it up is because a lot of people say that Godzilla can mean pollution. Godzilla himself does not really mean anti-pollution. Godzilla in this case is just the headlining monster fighting against the monster that actually talks about pollution. Hedorah's themes and his entire character, her entire character, revolve around the idea of pollution and what that means for humanity and how we have to change that. Without Godzilla present, and it was just a film completely focusing on Hedorah, it would be a pretty good film. And in a lot of ways it probably wouldn't sacrifice the themes that Godzilla has. And I think that's where there's a lot of struggle, because in these films, Biollante is another great example of this, similar to Hedorah, where the main thematic gist is revolving around what the other monster represents rather than Godzilla, and Godzilla fighting this monster brings in really good marquee value. And I think that this is most exasperated in films with versus like iconic monsters. Mothra, King Ghidorah, Mechagodzilla being the biggest examples of that, because those monsters being other creatures that have themes and ideas similar to Godzilla, they are usually the films that put Godzilla to the side and his themes to the side to accommodate the themes of the other monsters. And I think that a good monsterverse film should accommodate the themes for both characters. But I'd say the only time this is really an exception is King Kong, being the fact that he is from a different franchise, but King Kong's character has the underlying idea of tragedy, whereas Godzilla also has it, but with King Kong, it's the character himself having the tragedy, where Godzilla represents an external tragedy to his character, where when the characters were first introduced and brought to fight each other, you don't really see that, where a lot of the film is more of a satirization of Japanese television, TV as a whole taking over the country in ratings battles, and as a result, you are satirically looking at this through the lens of a fun monster boxing match, essentially. Whereas in Godzilla vs. Kong, the film is a shared universe, and in universe, you need to make up ideas as to why Godzilla and King Kong have to fight each other from their own internal logics, rather than using a story that has these characters in it. And I think that when it comes to success, a lot of the films that have really good thematic meanings for both monsters do really well, and Godzilla vs. Mothra, the 92 one, being a good example of this. But with King Kong, the reason why Godzilla vs. King Kong is always able to do well successfully, even if it is not the most thematically rich story, and when it comes to Godzilla vs. Kong or Godzillaxkongthenewempire, the New Empire, is because of the meta value that brings. Because King Kong is an iconic franchise, Godzilla is an iconic franchise, the two monsters are just able to exist as those characters, and the mimetic idea of two famous cinematic universes or monsters coming together to fight is what sparks the joy and the imagination in people, why people go to see those films, because they just like that idea. The idea of the crossover is so common nowadays that it's not necessarily no-brainer, but it makes sense as to why these films are so successful. And that's why a lot of people are concerned, because once that flavor of the week, the crossover, kind of wears off for these characters, what can they really do that's going to keep people engaged? Because the hardcore fans are going to stay. That goes without saying. But what will it mean when the idea of Godzilla and Kong sharing the screen no longer entices the viewer anymore? And as a result, I think that the flaw of the monsterverse is that Godzilla has meant so many different things across that franchise in and of itself. At the start, Godzilla was essentially just a giant animal, but there was this underlining idea of some kind of balance, whether that was like a spiritual, more thematic idea of balance in universe, or a literal one, which is more apparent in the later films. It's not really concretely stated, and as a result, you kind of linger with these ideas, but they are never fleshed out. In King of the Monsters, I think that this idea is expressed the most apparent, where while Godzilla is under control and in charge of the nature, you do see that humanity and the Titans are able to thrive by the end of the film, and without Godzilla, you do see the destruction that's wrought because of that. But that confuses a lot of Godzilla's character in later films, where Godzilla is picking fights with Kong for no reason other than a quote-unquote ancient rivalry. Even if Godzilla should know better that he should not be doing this at all, there's no reason for him to have this fight, but the only reason why the fight occurs there is because it is iconic to see Godzilla and King Kong fight each other, and that's where a lot of people take issue with that. So I think if there's one thing that needs to be changed or focused on with these Godzilla films, it's the idea of making sure that Godzilla's themes and what he means as a character are very apparent throughout the films that he appears in, and even with films where he is not the main monster or the main character, that the film is able to accommodate the message that he as a character brings. And ultimately, if a film can do both, they can have Godzilla's themes be expressed, another monster's expressed, and a character story be expressed in a way where they all intertwine in a very unique way, in a special way. You can really have something special on your hands, and I think that that's what a lot of people are craving for with these monster films. But yeah, I hope you really like this idea. These videos are unscripted. I want to do more on the channel, but again, if you haven't, please give this video a like, comment your thoughts. I want to hear what you guys have to say down there. Join the Discord, and again, if you're being really generous, please sign up for the Patreon. It will help me a ton to get more of these videos out here and work on other projects in the future. I'm Zimzilla, and I'll see you guys next time.